Many people have some understanding about the US role post-1945, supporting, backing, arming, training an insane number of regimes from the north of the globe to the south. What is far less known is that Israel was doing virtually the same thing. Reality is that Israel has for years been able to trial all these tools and technologies on Palestinians, everything from spyware to drones to biometric gathering to facial recognition technology, which is particularly obviously in the 21st century. And Palestinians are guinea pigs.
Welcome to the Big Picture podcast. My name is Mohamed Hassan, and today we sit down with investigative journalist and author Antony Loewenstein. Loewenstein has spent his career chronicling disaster capitalism, the global weapons trade, and in particular, Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. His most recent book, The Palestine Laboratory, is one of his most explosive, explaining how, from the early inception of the state, Israel built its economy around the research, manufacture, and export of high-end arms, selling them to some of the most reprehensible regimes in the world. These included the CIA-backed Contras in Nicaragua, the Guatemalan genocide of indigenous Mayans, Myanmar's ethnic cleansing campaign against the Rohingya, as well as South Africa's apartheid regime, which Israeli leaders in the 70s collaborated with and were inspired by. In some cases, Israel would sell weapons to a government on behalf of the United States when its ally didn't want to be seen publicly backing it. These military relationships helped prop up Israel as a diplomatic power, allowing it to evade criticism for its treatment of Palestinians, and more significantly, allowing it to use its occupied territories and the citizens in them as test subjects for its weapons and cybersecurity innovations. Antony Loewenstein, welcome to The Big Picture. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to talk to you about this book that came out last year, a couple of months before October 7th, and has been quite alarmingly relevant. I mean, it was relevant when you published it, but could not be more relevant today. And this book, The Palestine Laboratory, talks or attempts to unpack this idea of Israel as a quote-unquote startup nation. And what you outline is essentially a blueprint for a country that from quite early on established itself as a kind of military research and development hub for the world, for a lot of Western countries, and also a lot of very sketchy governments as well that were looking for high-tech, almost no strings attached weaponry, whether that's military weaponry or surveillance tech. And Israel has become this specialized nation in this kind of technology. Where does this begin for Israel? When does it go off on this journey to establishing itself as something like this?
I think very much near the beginning. So obviously Israel's founded in 1948, and pretty much near the start, leaders of Israel, David Ben-Gurion and others, realized that we're a new nation, we need to make friends. Now that's inherently not surprising. All new nations, East Timor is a relatively new nation, you have to make friends. The question is, how do you make those friends? And from the 1950s, Israel was already developing new weapons. Back then it wasn't that sophisticated, but guns and other things. And we're already selling those to countries, including in the late 50s, Germany. Now, of course, Germany was a pretty contentious choice because of the Holocaust, not that years before. And it was a lot discussed whether Israel should even have deep relations with Germany. In the end, there was a decision made that Israel would receive and accept huge amounts of money, essentially, you could call it blood money, apology money from Germany.
Reparations.
But it was contentious because many Jews, not unsurprisingly, were saying, sorry, I'm not going to take money from a country that just tried to kill me 10, 15 years ago. Anyway, Israel took the money and started selling weapons to Germany and other nations. And it was pretty clear from the 1960s that Israel was already forming relationships with huge amounts of nations in Africa and elsewhere. This is, of course, before the occupation began officially. I mean, I argue in the book the occupation, frankly, if you're a Palestinian, began in 1948, because from 48 to 67, if you're a Palestinian, you were not an equal citizen. You were not given equal rights. And I challenge this idea that for so much of the global Western left, including maybe some people watching this, Israel was a socialist paradise. So we were told. There were kibbutzes, there were left-wing Jews going to Israel in those years celebrating the wonderful openness and socialism. So we were told. It was all nonsense because if you were Jewish, sure. If you're a Palestinian, of course you were not. You're a second-class citizen. And 67 happened, Six-Day War. Israel wins that war pretty comprehensively. And soon after, I have documents of this in the book, declassified documents, there were some in Israel who were pretty concerned that a lot of the world did not accept what they had done. The occupation was beginning from day one. There were huge amounts of Palestinians under control of Israel they did not have before 67. What are we going to do with these people? There was no intention of giving the land back, but it was unclear what they would do. The occupation begins, settlements begin soon afterwards. And very much from the beginning, there was a decision made, and again, I have these 3 declassified documents in the book, of realizing that Israel could almost sell how it was managing, in inverted commas, the occupation to a global audience that wanted to get that experience. How do we, as another nation, occupy population? How do we control what was perceived as an enemy population? And you see, from the late 60s into the 70s, Israel became almost this one-stop shop for so-called counterterrorism. African nations, South American dictatorships, South African apartheid, all this goes on and on and on. And morality never came into it, unsurprisingly. This was about partly selling weapons and arms, but it was more than that. It was an ideology, and I think that's continued to this day, which we'll get to. But it's partly about other nations looking to Israel with admiration, saying, how do we control people like you are, and how do we get away with it? Because Israel essentially was and has to this day.
And you outline, I mean, the list of examples that you give are pretty dizzying. Whether that's Nicaragua and the sort of anti-communist fight that the US was backing with the Contras, whether that's South Africa, apartheid South Africa, whether that's Guatemala and the attacks on the indigenous population over there,
which led to a genocide.
In
the 80s. And Israel was supporting and arming and training those forces that committed that genocide.
And then there was also Myanmar more recently, and which also led to a genocide against the Rohingya. And what was the common thread between all of these different governments that Israel decided that it was going to do business with? A lot of these countries are countries that would have found it quite difficult buying and importing arms from a lot of other developed countries.
The logic in some ways was being part of the US umbrella. Now, obviously, we're at a time in the Cold War. The world is roughly split between those that supported the Soviets, those that supported the US, and of course the Soviets had its own allies, as did Washington. But part of the reason I wanted to put this history in the book was many people have some understanding about the US role post-1945, supporting, backing, arming, training an insane number of regimes from the north of the globe to the south. What is far less known is that Israel was doing virtually the same thing. Now, obviously, America's a bigger country, but Israel in some ways became a wingman of the US in the 60s and 70s, and that's continued to this day. And what I mean by that is that many, many nations that the US was backing, Chile when Pinochet took over in 73, South African apartheid and others, Israel would often come in and provide arms, provide training. In fact, at some points, I show this in the book, in the 1980s, CIA documents show that at that point in Chile, Israel was providing more weapons than the US to an unbelievably brutal dictatorship. The logic in some ways was befriending the global superpower, the US, and being seen as useful, so to speak, and making friends. Now, making friends, there weren't not too many questions asked. Making friends means backing, training, arming the most brutal regime. South Africa, though, is a slightly different case, and briefly explain why. That, yes, there was arms deals, yes, but it was ideological alignment. That you have lots and lots of declassified documents, which I have in the book, showing how South African leaders, this is before apartheid fell, of course, in 1994, South African leaders and Israeli leaders admired each other, white South Africans admired what Israel was doing to Palestinians, mostly Muslims, although some Christians too. And Israel really admired what white South Africa was doing to the blacks, oppressing them, apartheid. And I show, and I've spoken to lots of people, even since the book came out, to show that alliance, that backing of each other's repression was because both nations thought and argued they were fighting barbarism in their own backyard. Black population, Palestinians, and getting inspiration from each other. So Israeli leaders would go to South Africa, look at the Bantustans, where blacks were essentially herded, and say, we could do something similar with Palestinians. And to some extent, what Israel has created in Palestine is remarkably similar to that. Different, but similar. And I think the current International Court of Justice case, fast forward more than half a century, has a direct line from Israel backing apartheid South Africa to this day. And what I mean by that is that many South African leaders, including the ones who are in charge now, and the ANC in South Africa, let's be clear, is a deeply problematic organisation, very corrupt. This is not idealising the ANC at all. They don't need to be idealised. But in relation to this case, many of them said in the last months, we have not forgotten what Israel did to our people in the 70s and 80s and 90s, meaning supporting our oppressors. And almost, they have not said this, but I'm saying this is almost, it's our chance, South Africa's chance, to get justice for our people. Now, obviously, what's happening at the ICJ is not about South Africa, it's about Palestine, Gaza. But I see a real strong historical line between these two events decades ago, because at the end of apartheid, Mandela said, I have the quote in the book, I'm paraphrasing, something like, we will not forget what Israel did to our people, namely backing, arming, training our oppressors. And half a century on, I think the South African leaders now who are pushing the ICJ to try to stop Israel's genocide in Gaza are remembering what Israel did to them and their ancestors not that long ago. And they're angry, and rightly so.
And there's two parts to the argument that you set out in the book. One is these relations that you talk about, these arms deals, this development of high-tech weaponry and weapon systems, and exporting them to a lot of governments that are looking for that kind of ability to control their own populations or populations that they rule over. And another part of this is where the title of the book comes from, the Palestine Laboratory, is the fact that not only was Israel able to develop these weapons, but they were able to show how they were used. Can you talk about how that kind of idea developed?
Battle tested, essentially, that you've had pretty much really since the 1950s, but definitely much more so since the occupation in 1967 began, so more than half a century, that Israel has on its doorstep a ready-made population of occupied people. Now, for those who don't know, if you live in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and I lived in East Jerusalem for many years and been visiting and working there for about 20, people often don't realise everything is so close. If you're in Jerusalem, to get to Gaza takes an hour.
It's such a tiny place.
It's a tiny place. Now, obviously, the worlds of Gaza and Jerusalem could not be more different, especially now. But it's tiny. It's literally down the road. So, of course, this willful blindness that many Israeli Jews have towards Palestine is nonsense, because they know what's going on. I mean, they might say they don't know all the details. The Israeli press is very nationalistic. All that's true. But the battle testing reality is that Israel has for years been able to trial all these tools and technologies on Palestinians, everything from spyware to drones to biometric gathering, to facial recognition technology, which is particularly obviously in the 21st century. And Palestinians are guinea pigs. So look at Hebron, arguably one of the worst examples of Israeli apartheid in Palestine. And what happens in Hebron often then spreads beyond in Palestine. Hebron is often viewed as a real testing ground for the worst aspects of the occupation. And much of what you find in Hebron ends up being spread around Palestine. So at the moment, in the last years in Hebron, you have the most sophisticated forms of intelligence gathering, biometric tools. This is often used by Israeli troops. They have things on their mobile devices called Red Wolf and Blue Wolf, ways to gather every detail of every single Palestinian man, woman and child. And that is used to control Palestinians. Palestinian X wants to go to his or her village, want to go into Israel for work, whatever it may be. And whatever information has been gathered, of course, the Palestinians don't know, there's no transparency, God knows what's being gathered, but it's personal details. I mean, cameras often are being used directly into people's homes.
This is like cameras, security cameras with facial recognition software.
Exactly, indeed. So-called security cameras, security for Israel. Although, of course, the great irony, the great tragic irony of all this, which we can talk about, is none of this is making Israel safe or Jews safe. Talking globally, including me as a Jew. None of it is. It's actually making us more unsafe, but we can come back to that. But the battle testing element is important because when Israel then sells, promotes and markets all these tools and technologies, as they do for years, a lot of other countries, police forces, militaries love the fact that it has been tested in Palestine. And you fast forward to October 7 and what's been happening in the last 5 or so months since Israel's unbelievably brutal war on Gaza, is Israel's live testing huge amounts of weapons as we speak. New drones, surveillance equipment. There was a piece just recently in Haaretz, the Israeli Jewish newspaper, talking about how Israel's live testing, this is their words, robot dogs, the most sophisticated robot dogs. And I know how this works. You fast forward a month or a year, and those will appear in other conflicts around the world. And it's almost hard to not see articles like that. I mean, I've written a book about this, so I don't think my book is although some would argue it's an advertisement for how, inverted commas, effective Israeli technology is. Of course, I don't view it that way. But articles like that in Haaretz, as one example, really is an ad. It's basically saying to countries, you want to see the most sophisticated robot dogs that can fight wars for you in country X or country Y, we're testing it now and we'll sell it to you. And that's why I've said since October 7, I'm pretty confident the Israeli arms industry will not suffer because of what's happened. On the face of it, that might seem insane because on October 7, Israel's intelligence, defense and military collapsed. I mean, there's no other way to view it. A complete catastrophe from Israel's perspective. The military disappeared for a day? I mean, it was just insane what happened. All the huge technology of surveillance around Gaza disappeared, or Hamas was able to disable it. But there's been no accountability or accounting for that within Israel, really. And many of the companies that had built that technology that failed are now promoting new technology in Gaza and are trying to promote it globally. And I'm moderately confident that many nations will somehow forget or ignore October 7, what happened, what didn't happen, and want to buy those tools and technologies. Just finally, I mean, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, huge amounts of European nations have come to Israel begging, really, to buy the most sophisticated missile defense shields and other tools. And I don't see any indication why those nations still won't continue to buy that equipment. The Russian war on Ukraine hasn't stopped. It's bloody. It's arguably a stalemate now. And all those European nations, from Germany to Finland, there's no reason why they would stop buying that material from Israel. So as Israel's economy has to some extent suffered because of the war, huge amounts of people have gone into the reserves, they're fighting in Gaza, often their workplaces have been left for months. Israel's going to need, frankly, a thriving defense industry. And sadly and tragically and revealingly, many nations will be pretty happy to buy some of that tech that's been battle tested in Gaza.
Our goal is to take the concept of precision weaponry to missiles, fighter planes, and in some cases armored infantry carriers, or to the most basic infantry company.
According to this company, the American troops deployed in Iraq and in Syria are already equipped with this technology. An operational system for Israeli soldiers in sensitive areas is also in use in Gaza or on the Lebanese-Syrian border.
I remember watching the Top Gun sequel. Very high budget.
I'm sorry to hear that. I saw that recently too.
I mean, yeah.
It's a nice piece of propaganda.
That's exactly kind of why I bring it up, is because I was watching it and there was so much hype around the fact that they were using real military-grade aircrafts and they were shooting in the air, and so much of it is about promoting U.S. military superiority and making it look really cool.
Against a unnamed enemy, which I think, if I recall, was probably Iran, was it? I don't think it was named. Or
China.
Could have been
Iran, could have been China, could have been Russia, could have been anybody.
One of the designated enemies, yes.
Which is a great advertisement, right? It's non-specific, But I remember thinking about, watching this film. I'm watching it through my own lens of like, oh, this is entertainment. But that with the amount of money and amount of access that these filmmakers have to this technology from the military, from the Air Force, is that this is also an advertisement. This is a very well-polished, well-made advertisement, and that there will be people watching around the world, some of them government officials, some of them people in defense ministries, that are going to watch this film and then say, I want that. I want to have access to that.
Absolutely. And of course, it's so important to remember, right? When the first Top Gun came out, the world was different. America is still the global superpower, but clearly it's being challenged by China. Russia doesn't really challenge America, militarily or economically. Russia is a very, I would argue, quite a small, weak state. Can be incredibly violent in Ukraine. I'm not minimizing that, but Russia is not challenging American supremacy. China is. And of course, there's a long history of US films, Hollywood colluding with the US military. It goes back from years. Top Gun, Zero Dark 30, propaganda, TV shows trying to inject certain pro-military lines into sitcoms. The history for that is quite long. And I hear you. I think a lot of people watching Top Gun, even those who might not necessarily think of it as a propaganda film, which it clearly was, would have walked out of that assuming they didn't think too critically and think, wow, that was really exciting. It shows that the Air Force can be kind of sexy. Everyone's kind of good looking. I think there was a bit of sex, if I remember. All that kind of idea of and of course the first Top Gun was very similar. And it was used by the US Air Force for years as a recruiting tool. And it's important, the context, right, is that the US military has a recruitment problem, has for years, particularly since 9/11, where the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were a disaster. The death toll, of course, of Iraqis and Afghans, but American soldiers was high. And the wars kind of, inverted commas, finished. America didn't win. In fact, they lost. Afghanistan, that was clear. The Taliban were overthrown in 3 weeks in 2001. Now they're back in charge. Insane. And Iraq is a broken state. And I think America, I don't know all the machinations behind the scenes, but I'm moderately confident there would have been lots of conversations between Top Gun makers, Hollywood, and the military to say, we have a recruitment problem. Can we make this new sequel incredibly sexy and hot to try to bring in new recruits for our future war fighting against China, whoever it may be?
And I without drawing too much of a dark parallel, one of the things that you highlight in the book, and one of the things I was thinking about reading it, is the footage that we are seeing coming out of Gaza, and the footage, the news footage that has been almost synonymous with how we see Gaza as an international community. The horror of it could be seen, and probably is seen, through what you argue, through a different lens by other people who could be watching the footage of mass destruction and
in a positive way.
In a positive way, or with a sense of curiosity.
Absolutely. And most humane, decent people see what Israel's doing in Gaza and are lost for words. It's utter destruction. There is a clear attempt to, I use the term in the book, politicide. Obviously, there's a serious suggestion it's actually genocide, but politicide is similar but different. Politicide is to try to, and Israel's not unique in doing this, the Myanmar regime will try and do it to the Rohingyas, but in the Israeli case, it is to try to extinguish a so-called opponent's possibilities of any kind of identity. Now, that's not always through death. It might be through political repression, jailing, etc. And I think what Israel is doing in Gaza is quite possibly genocide, certainly politicide. And you're absolutely right. What I'm seeing in many of the defense magazines, right-wing Israeli media, some so-called liberal media like Haaretz, right-wing social media, is very much an admiration for what Israel has done in Gaza. Because ultimately, a lot of nations look to the situation there and say, no one stopped Israel doing this. No one. Hopefully there's a ceasefire and it's permanent. But the fact is that there is no serious global power, namely the US or the EU, has any real interest in stopping the war beyond the occasional bleating from Biden or Kamala Harris, or maybe, I remember about a month ago, there was the head of the EU's foreign affairs, Joseph Borrell, saying, if the world wants Israel to stop attacking Gaza, maybe they should stop selling weapons to them. And I thought to myself, okay, do you think maybe a journalist could then ask, you mean like your EU colleagues? What do you think the EU is doing in the last 5 months? I mean, Germany has sold an insanely unprecedented amount of weapons to Israel since October 7, as have other European nations. So I'm almost positive that is for rhetorical use either. There's no real pressure from him or anyone to stop selling the weapons. And I think when you see Israel using, which they had used before October 7, but AI-enabled warfare, the so-called the gospel, where this is what the system is called, where Israel is getting huge amounts of intelligence, both from human intelligence, AI, surveillance, for targeting, allegedly to go after Hamas militants, so they claim, but the reality is, as my sources have said and other more honest Israelis, the aim is not to be pinpoint, the aim is mass destruction. That is the point. And that's pretty obvious when you see what's happened to Gaza. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Gaza in the last 20 years and places, and I have friends in Gaza still who I'm trying to help to get out, just to get away from this carnage. And all their homes have been destroyed. I mean, these are people, the ones who are alive. Of course, there's 30, 35, 40,000 who have been killed. And their whole world is ruined. And I think a lot of nations are looking with admiration, though, at what Israel is doing in Gaza. The use of AI-enabled warfare, surveillance drones, robot dogs, whatever it may be, and are saying now, I want a piece of that. I want to do this in my own country, in my own war. And yes, other nations are battle testing. The US did this in Iraq and Afghanistan. The US, in fact, in Ukraine is doing it in Ukraine now in the last 2 or so years. But the difference, I think, in Gaza is that, as I said before, Israel has a ready-made occupied population on its doorstep, the West Bank and Gaza, for more than half a century. And what I say in the book over and over and over again, and Gaza has proven this tragically again, many nations want to learn, how do you get away with it? How do you get away with doing this? There is a likely genocide and 30, 40,000 people killed, the vast majority of whom are not Hamas, are civilians, men, women, children. And no one stopped you. No one has stopped you. There's no sanctions. There's no arms embargo. The Arab leaders who expressed such deep concern for Palestine, they haven't cut ties, and they won't. The Arab people's a different story. I'm talking about Arab leadership. Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi. They don't care about the Palestinians. They've never cared about them. Again, leadership I'm talking about. It's lip service. Why? And I say this in the book, that the whole outrage that many people in the Arab world feel towards their leaders, for a range of reasons, corruption, economic problems, not just about Palestine, of course, is that their leaders are petrified, in my research, of another Arab Spring. Now, the Arab Spring has ended up being a bit of a disaster for a range of reasons I won't have to go into, but they are petrified of their own people rising up. And how are they protecting themselves against that? The most sophisticated surveillance equipment in the world, sold by Israel. So you have in the last year Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, and others buying all this surveillance tech from Israel. And Israel feels, correctly in my view, they have an insurance policy of sorts of their Arab neighbors taking them on. I'm not saying militarily, but taking them on even rhetorically. I mean, all the words that you've heard in the last 5 months from Arab leaders, they're disturbed, they're concerned, we hope the war ends. That's not because they themselves think that. They would not care if Hamas was destroyed tomorrow. No interest in Hamas surviving. Yes, some of them are, Qatar and others obviously are housing Hamas or have allowed Hamas to live there, particularly Qatar, which plays a very curious role in the Middle East. But ultimately, their desire is to appease their own people's anger with what's happening in Gaza, that the many people I speak to say, why aren't our leaders doing more? Why aren't they cutting ties? Why aren't they imposing arms embargoes? They won't. Because for them, the relationship with Israel and therefore Washington is more important. And regardless of if Israel kills 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, 500,000 Palestinians, there are some horrific imaginings that some Arab states may be forced to actually cut ties. I mean, there's been talk about if somehow huge amounts of Palestinians are forcibly pushed into the Sinai, that Egypt somehow is either forced or is bribed or whatever it is to allow all these people who are pushed up against the Rafah crossing, they may be under so much pressure to cut ties with Israel. Nothing's impossible. But tragically, I think it's very unlikely. So all these Arab states are so complicit in what Israel has not just been doing since October 7, but for years.
And a part of that, you argue, is to do specifically with Israel's ability to provide and sell state-of-the-art military equipment, surveillance equipment, which has become incredibly sought after in the time that we live in today.
This, I think, is what, I mean, years ago when the so-called Abraham Accords, which was done at the tail end of Trump's first term, I fear we might be moving towards the second, but the end of the first term, it was sold as normalization between Israel and these Arab states. And of course, it seemed, from what we understand, that Saudi was moving towards a similar so-called normalization with Israel. October 7 happened. I fear that could still happen, actually, but it may be delayed by a few months or a year or whatever. But what all these nations in the Arab world want is sophisticated spyware, Pegasus and others, surveillance equipment, to go after their own people, to try to avoid any kind of uprising, any kind of serious dissent or questioning. So when you have all these American, Thomas Friedman comes to mind, the wonderful, where to even begin with Thomas Friedman, but people like Friedman, who I think
he's probably in the back of a taxi as we speak.
Exactly. Thomas Friedman represents a lot of people in the US foreign policy establishment, as he's been writing, frankly, for 40 years. But even more so since October 7, the New York Times columnist, in case people don't know who I'm talking about, who is obsessively pushing this idea the Arab nations need to normalize with Israel, which apparently will protect the Arab nations and Israel. I'm not quite sure how it helps Arab civilians who are living under repressive regimes, or frankly Palestinians who are living under apartheid and occupation. But putting that clearly minor issue aside, he's continually pushing and obsessed with Saudi needs to normalize with Israel. Saudi should make a deal with Israel if only Israel would accept the concept of a Palestinian state. As if somehow, still since October 7, it has been infuriating to watch, although comical in a grim way, Biden, the EU, much of the Western powers, the Arab leaders saying, right, okay, when this war ends, we're back on track for a two-state solution. I'm thinking, hang on a minute, sorry, who are you trying to convince? Where is the constituency for this? It's mostly not in Palestine, and it's certainly not in Israel. In most public opinion polls in Israel before October 7, there was less than 50% support for a two-state solution. That number is now plummeted since in the last months. So who exactly are you pushing it for? Are you pushing it, if you're Biden, for voters in Michigan? Who are you pushing this for? It's not the people who are actually going to be living under a so-called two-state solution. And of course, the vision that Israel is pushing, yes, it's Netanyahu and his government, but as I've been saying for years, the Western media is obsessed with Netanyahu. And yes, he's the prime minister. The buck stops with him. Obviously, we can't ignore him. And his far-right government, which is a disturbing group of thugs and fascists. Not denying that for a second. But if anyone believes that a likely alternative, Benny Gantz and others, is going to be much different on these key issues. In fact, as we're recording this, Benny Gantz is in the US talking to the Biden administration about next steps. Netanyahu is upset with him. But what he's trying to apparently do is to get American support for a potential invasion of Rafah. This is not a man who's interested in peace. My point being that...
Well, he's a former head of the IDF.
Exactly. And in various campaigns that he has run for politics in the last 10 years, he regularly runs campaigns, people can Google this, showing how much of Gaza he has destroyed. That's a key selling point. So if anyone thinks that if Netanyahu falls as prime minister tomorrow or next week, and eventually he will, I mean, he's been seemingly in charge forever, but at some point he will fall, the likely alternatives on these key issues, occupation, settlements, Gaza, the next day, is very little different. And I think that goes to the heart of what has happened to Israel, which is Israeli Jews have been radicalized for decades. And this, I think, is something that many in the West have willfully ignored.
So there's this idea that you talk about sort of earlier on in the book with regards to the way that Israel has positioned itself from the very beginning, and even before the creation of Israel, as this sort of bastion of Europeanness, of civilization, at the edge of Europe, on the border of Europe. And there's this quote that I want to read that you have here from Theodor Herzl, the so-called father of Zionism. And he said this in 1896, "There we shall be a sector of the wall of Europe against Asia. We shall serve as the outpost of civilization against barbarism."
Yeah. I mean, you know what's amazing hearing that is nothing has changed. In the last month since October 7, you have key Israeli politicians, from Netanyahu down, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, using exactly the same language, essentially saying, if we, Israel, are not supported in our war against barbarism, Hamas, terrorism, this terrorism will end up on the streets of Paris or London or Washington. In other words, you, the West, the world, needs to help us fight this war, because if you don't, you're all going to pay a price in lovely liberal Europe. And that argument, I mean, that it's not even subtle anymore. I mean, arguably never was. But as obviously the world has, at least in theory, partly decolonized in the last half century, lots of the world arguably is still colonized, of course, but parts have decolonized. That language that many Israeli leaders and many Israelis believe is still very mainstream and frankly accepted in many parts of the West, in the media and political elites. And I don't see any indication that October 7 really is changing that. Yes, the horrific Hamas attack, but then the last months of utter indiscriminate Israeli attack has almost shown that, with a few notable exceptions, Spain, Ireland, a few handful of those European states that at least have expressed concern, better than nothing, pretty much the whole West has been in support. The US, much of Europe, the EU certainly has, Australia has, New Zealand obviously has a relatively new government. They've pretty much been on board, like most Western nations have been. And it makes, I think, a lot of people realize, if more evidence was needed, Palestinian lives don't matter like Israeli lives. Jewish blood is seen as far more important and redder than Palestinian blood. And that's been the case, sadly, for decades. And I say this obviously as someone Jewish who has seen how within my own Jewish community, Palestinian lives for years were treated as not just secondary, but unimportant. What matters is our security, our lives. And the tragic irony of what Israel has arguably always been, but certainly has become even more so in the last half century, is none of what Israel's doing in the West Bank, Gaza, is making any of us safer. It's actually making us more unsafe, because Israel's created, as was imagined more than half a century ago, a garrison state. It's a ghetto. I mean, the irony of a Jewish state, Jews who were, with some justification, saying at the beginning of Zionism, we can never be safe in Europe because of anti-Semitism, we need to create our own state. Now, of course, that was on the back of Palestinians, clearly in 1948. But anti-Semitism in Europe was obviously real, of course it was, culminating in the Holocaust, a cataclysmic event that a lot of my family were killed in. But now Israel in 2024 is building for itself a country literally surrounded by walls. It's ghettoizing itself as a people who had, at least in theory, wanted to escape the European ghetto to build so they claimed, I mean, of course, I would disagree with which is what they did, but a thriving democracy in the heart of the Middle East on the back of Palestinian lives and blood. But now, 80 or so years after the establishment of Israel, a nation that can only survive as a garrison state because there are so many people who not just don't want it to be there, but are implacably opposed to its actions. It's its actions that are making anti-Semitism worse. I mean, anti-Semitism is complicated, and some people hate Jews because they're bad people. I get that. And it's worsening in some parts of the world, and that worries me. But to suggest that Israeli actions in Gaza and beyond have no impact on how the wider community views Jews is ludicrous. And it worries me because I see the average person who's maybe not that connected to this issue, who maybe has some sympathy for Palestinians, says, hang on, you have all these, since October 7, Israeli soldiers filming themselves in Gaza for TikTok and other social media platforms, abusing Palestinians, humiliating them, stealing their goods from Gazan homes. What does that say to you about Israeli Jews? And because Israel and many of its supporters say there's no difference between Judaism and Zionism, the one and the same thing, it's not surprising that many people in the wider community say, oh, right, so I just don't like Jews because they abuse Palestinians.
You're speaking now with a Jewish journalist. Most of our viewers are Jews. How should I feel?
As an Israeli citizen, someone who understands your identity, who has a sense of nationhood and peoplehood and the history and of an experience of the Jewish people, you should respect someone like me who has analogous feelings about whites. I mean, you could say that I am a white Zionist in the sense that I care about my people. I want us to have a secure homeland that's for us and ourselves, just like you want a secure homeland in Israel.
We're talking about Richard Spencer, the alt-right figurehead, and he called himself, as you said, a white Zionist, and he said
proud
white Zionist, and he said that he is fighting for a white ethno-state like Israel.
And a lot of people, when they hear that, just think, sorry, what are you talking about? How could a white nationalist, white supremacist have any affinity for Israel? And I talk about this in the book quite a lot.
And they're pretty openly anti-Semitic.
Openly anti-Semitic. And I guess there's two ways to look at this. One, as I show in the book, there's a long history of Israel supporting the worst anti-Semitic regimes in the last half century plus. Argentina, Romania, and others. Those regimes, anti-Semitism was no impediment to selling weapons. That's the first thing. And of course, some of those South American nations, by the way, were taking in Nazis after the Second World War. They were literally hiding Nazis. Had no impediment to Israel working with them meaning training them, giving them weapons. The more contemporary example, though, is that if you go, as I have done sometimes for work purposes, to far-right rallies, Australia, US, UK, Europe, it's not unusual to see the Israeli flag. Now, on the face of it, that seems ridiculous. Why would anti-Semites want the Israeli flag? And Spencer has articulated this, as have others. They don't like Jews. That's not the point. What they like, though, is Israel proudly creating a Jewish supremacist state. If you are not Jewish in Israel, Israel proper or under occupation, you are not treated as an equal citizen. The white nationalist worldview is a Christian, ethno-nationalist white state where Christians are given benefits and everyone else, including Jews, by the way, would not be. And this has really manifested itself in a range of ways, even recently. In Israel, the Israeli government welcomed to Israel, this is after October 7, leaders of one of Sweden's most extreme far-right political parties, neo-Nazi backgrounds. And this was, I think, as far as I can tell, ignored by virtue of the entire global press. I wrote a bit about it. It was in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, to its credit. Essentially saying, we have shared values. It's their words. Now, what are those shared values? A hatred of Muslims, hatred of Islam as a whole, a hatred of multiculturalism, a belief of ethno-nationalism, which obviously in the Swedish group's case would be a Christian ethno-nationalist state. Of course, in Israel, it's a Jewish nationalist state. And those Israel, I would argue, is building a loose global coalition of those kinds of entities. I show in the book huge examples in the last 10 years of Israel often supporting the most far-right groups in Europe. Vox, for example, the Spanish far-right political party. History of anti-Semitism, history of admiration for Nazism. I mean, what is going on? But in some ways it makes a lot of sense. This is the ultimate endpoint, I would argue, of where Israel is going. Because increasingly so-called liberal Western elites, for want of a better expression, are increasingly turning against Israel. Not all. There are still liberals in America who support Israel. I'm not minimizing that, even after October 7. In fact, some would say because of October 7, ignoring what's happened in the last months in Gaza, but this idea that somehow our duty as a liberal is to support Israel. But it's pretty hard to sustain that when increasingly Israel is partnering proudly with the most far-right forces globally, from Hungary to Sweden to India and beyond. It's not some official organised camping retreat where they all kind of go away and make global plans, but Israel is building that alliance. Weapons is part of it. And all those nations I mentioned, mostly, Israel is selling weapons to, but it's not just about that. I think it's broader than that. I think Israel is looking for ideological support for its occupation, and in the UN or elsewhere. And also I think there is a belief within some in the Israeli far right that it's more important to have supporters of its occupation than actually acknowledging that you're partnering with people who don't like you because you're Jewish. And this is what tragically and concerningly so much of modern Judaism has become. Judaism and Zionism obviously are not the same. However, for too many Jews, Israel is their religion. It's replaced their religion. So many Jews don't practice their religion. They don't observe, which is fine, of course. But Israel is their religion. And I think this militant, hard-right nationalism, which is in the ascendancy in Israel, which arguably has taken over the state long before October 7, long before Netanyahu's current government, is mirrored in many countries around the world of saying we as Jews have a moral responsibility because of our history, because of the Holocaust, to support Israel, regardless of what they're doing in the West Bank or Gaza. And that kind of moral abomination, in my view, is leading so much of so-called mainstream Judaism off a cliff. Again, there's growing amounts of young Jews who are critical of what's happening. I've written about it. That's the only silver lining to me of this. That there's a growing constituency. It's much more visible in the US, the UK. It's a minority, but a growing vocal minority who say not in my name, particularly since October 7, but before that. But the sad reality is that many in the Jewish mainstream are running with Israel off the cliff, backing the most extreme, militant, hardline Zionists. Now, if you ask them face to face, apart from the crazies, they probably would say, oh no, we don't support pogroms. God, we don't support Israeli Jews burning Palestinian kids. Oh no, of course we don't support that. That's terrible. I mean, there's some, of course, who do support that, tragically, but many will not say they acknowledge or support that. But if you're not, as a Jew, actively fighting against it, you are supporting that. That's what Israel has become. A nation that supports and backs, and not just the current government, pogroms. With the history of Jews, to even support pogroms against Palestinians is horrific. And that's what's, sadly, for many in the West Bank, their daily life. And this is something that I feel like so much of my work on this issue, a lot of my work over the years, in the last 20 years, has not just been about Israel-Palestine. The war in Afghanistan, the war on drugs, disaster capitalism, written books and films, partly because I didn't want to just write about this issue. It's taxing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I feel a moral responsibility as a, secular Jew to say, not just not in my name, but to try to rally more Jews to say, this is how we're being defined. Much of the world sees us as supporting this, Gaza, pogroms. Unless you speak out and fight against this, this is how we as Jews are viewed. And that to me is, I would argue, deeply, deeply worrying.
You were in India recently promoting your book. And India is a government that has become very close politically to Israel, increasingly so over the last few years. And a part of it, as you mentioned, is military sales. I think Israel's the biggest exporter of weapons to India, which
Virtually
is
unknown fact, but yes.
It's an insane thing to think about,
Yeah.
given the size of India. The size of India's growing military. But I think increasingly there's also this ideological element to what India is accused of doing in its pursuit of a Hindu nationalist state and identity, and what it sees happening in Israel. What was that trip like? What were some of the things that you were hearing from people that were coming to speak to you that had read your book?
I went to the Jaipur Literary Festival, which is actually the biggest writers' festival in the world. It has, it's every January, February, and it has 450,000 people. I mean, just the scale is unimaginable. It's huge. And I had been about 12 years ago, but had wanted to come back, and I was invited this year, 2024, to speak partly about my book. And before I left, in fact, a few people had messaged me saying, we're really concerned that you're going to this. Are you going to speak out about Kashmir? Are you going to speak out about Hindu fundamentalism? Are you going to feel kind of hamstrung because you're in India and you don't want to basically upset, not that I was invited by the Indian government, but upset the Modi regime? Yeah. And I was determined, I don't mean this to say how brave am I, but I was determined, no, I am going to go there. I am going to speak out critically. I went to the festival and I spoke a number of times, and a lot of to both the public and also a lot of Indian media in English. And I did speak critically about saying what is happening in Kashmir is an abomination. It's inspired by what Israel's doing in the West Bank. India's doing it for its own reasons, but it's increasingly inspired. I mean, to the point where about a month ago, near Delhi, a lot of farmers were protesting unjust policies and economic struggles. And India was dropping tear gas from drones on these farmers. And in the Indian press, it's not my words, their words, they were literally saying, this is the model from Israel. And I think
these are the drones that we saw in 2018 during the Great March of Return.
Indeed. And as I talk about that in the book. And it's important to say that because, again, India is becoming a Hindu fundamentalist state for its own reasons, not because of Israel. But, and I think it's important to say that much of the West is turning a blind eye to what's happening in India because they're not China. And it's the largest country in the world, largest population in the world, largest self-described democracy. I would question whether it's a democracy, but that's how it describes itself. There's an election this year, almost guaranteed Modi will win for a third term. His power will be consolidated. And the impact of that is that the roughly 200 million Muslims are scared. They're scared because there already are regular pogroms against them by Hindu nationalists, supported by the state, supported by many in the media for that matter. So the response I had in India was, I don't want to suggest the festival was like a liberal oasis, that'd be too simplistic, but there are a lot of Indians who don't like what's going on. And many of them came up to me, and I've never experienced anything like this in my life. I've been a journalist now for around just over 20 years, and I was being literally mobbed. I mean, that could be good or bad. In this case, it was mostly positive. I get a lot of hate mail from people too. I'm not minimizing any of that. But I was mobbed by a lot of predominantly Indians, young and old. The general consensus was, we cannot say what you're saying. In other words, I guess I was using my privilege to say what is happening to this country with the support of the US and the UK and Israel, both ideologically and through weapons, is petrifying. And it was encouraging to me that a lot of Indians came up to me and said, if we say this online, publicly, even sometimes to friends, we could lose our jobs. We could start being investigated for dodgy tax returns, which would be bollocks, but that's how the Indian government often tries to target you. You're caught up in legal problems for years that destroys your life. You can't focus on anything else. I heard this constantly. So yeah, I was... Just briefly, I was, I guess, trying to explain there, but also in the book, that the growing ideological alignment, we talked before about the far right. I see India in some ways as the greatest example of that, because I see India and Israel today remarkably similar to Israel and South African apartheid back in the day. And that's something that I think many people are not aware of.
Looking 5 months on from October 7th, from when a lot of what you wrote about came to life once again in probably the most vivid way imaginable. How do you reflect on this book? What do you think has changed? Has your opinion about any of what's in the book changed over the last 5 months?
No, is the short answer. Not because everything I write was correct, although I think it mostly has been. What I say at the end of the book, it doesn't ruin it for people who should buy the book, is I feared, and I wasn't alone in this, some cataclysmic event, a war. Of course, I didn't know what that was going to be, a war, a conflict, an attack, something, which would unleash forces within Israel which were not entirely dormant, but were not necessarily right at the top of the agenda, to, inverted commas, allow mass violence, mass ethnic cleansing. Now, of course, I didn't imagine exactly what would happen on October 7. No one really did. But that is now playing out. And what's happening now is on a scale far greater than the Nakba. I say that because of displacement numbers and deaths is much higher than 1948. Now, we're still dealing with, we, Palestinians principally, are still dealing with the ramifications of 1948 now, close to, 80 years on. One can only imagine the long-term ramifications of what's been going on today in the last month since October 7. One of the things that I have reflected a lot about on since then in relation to the book is a few things. One, that the level of extremism and radicalism within Israel, the Israeli Jewish population, is off the leash. Now, it's been off the leash for a long time, but it's now on a whole different level. There is, I think, a willful blindness in much of the West to what that extremism has brought. I say in the book, there's a poll from 2016 saying that virtually half of Israeli Jews support ethnic cleansing. That was 2016. Fast forward to November 2023 last year. There were polls in Israel showing that a clear majority of Israelis supported so-called voluntary immigration, ethnic cleansing, of Palestinians from Gaza. Now, every country has racism, Australia, UK, the US, obviously. But I would argue that I cannot think of any Western nation with that level of radicalism. And of course, importantly, runs the country. And the level of destruction and despair and just unleashing hell on Gaza has, on a daily basis, both shocked me and unsurprised me. Shocked me because I'm human and I have friends in Gaza, and my partner and I are trying to get a family out, like a lot of people are, and it's very hard. And all the reasons people know. It's just a humanitarian catastrophe and countries aren't stepping up and all the things that we know. But I'm unsurprised in a way because the forces that were unleashed on Gaza from within Israel have been there for a long time. Not just from Netanyahu, the Ben Gavirs of this world. Yes, their politics are clear. This could only happen with mainstream Israeli Jewish support. And it has that support that many polls since October 7 has said that Israelis want there to be more force used. They think that Israel's not doing enough in Gaza, not destroying enough of Gaza. So if the vision, so to speak, is to make Gaza literally flattened and unlivable, which is really where it's going, there are really only a few options of where we go from here. We either go from Israel trying to move settlers back in, and some viewers will be aware that in late February, some settlers in fact did enter Gaza. Briefly, some soldiers allowed it, some didn't. That's going to only keep happening. Whether there's going to be thousands of settlers in a year or two, of course, I don't know. I think if there's a change of prime minister in Israel, that maybe is a bit less likely, but who knows? But regardless of that, for the majority of Palestinians that I have known in Gaza for years, they would never leave. Almost saying, regardless of how bad the siege on Gaza was for close to 20 years, we will not leave. That is now changing. I'm not saying every Gazan can leave or want to leave, but there's nothing left. So you can't really blame if a Palestinian says from Gaza, I want a better life for my kids, for my family, somewhere, who knows where that is. Who cannot understand that, considering what is left in Gaza? So the long-term ramifications to me, which worry me in relation to what I wrote about and what we touched on about Jewish nationalism and militarism, is that extreme, although sadly mainstream view of Judaism, which says that what Israel is doing in Gaza is somehow making Israelis safer, or it's bringing the destruction of Hamas, which is arguably impossible. All that is making Israel a safer nation is so delusional, because apart from the many Gazans who are now suffering, who are orphans, they are going to be understandably damn angry. That's the first thing. But in a wider sense, what do you think so much of the world thinks of Israel? What do we think a lot of people, not just in the global south, but parts of the global north, particularly younger Americans and others, not all, but many, Israel is a pariah. And I think you will see in years to come a massively increased boycott campaign. You will see attempts at arms embargoes. You will see a number of nations, maybe South Africa, maybe others, trying to put out arrest warrants for General X, Soldier Y. Now, will there be trials? I don't know. But I think there will be an attempt, because the Western nations, the US and others, will likely fail in holding Israel to account. If Biden wins this year, or Trump, as we know, there'll be little difference when it comes to Israel. But nations like South Africa or others say they are determined to try to hold Israel to account. And what I'm, as I said, the only silver lining in the Jewish community, which I have to feel, which is a degree of reality, is there needs to be a huge surge in a more humane Judaism. Because ultimately, although at some point there will need to be some negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians, this is a long way down the track. At some point, the ANC negotiated with white South Africa. At some point, sanctions and years, there was negotiation. There was a gun to the head of white South Africa, essentially saying you have to really end this apartheid regime. But a Judaism which is not so militaristic and nationalistic and racist is the only viable outcome for a people who have suffered in the past so much, but now only see themselves, like talking about Jews, as eternal victims. We are the only victim. We will commit genocide in Gaza, we're still the victim. Endless occupation, we're the ultimate victim. And that takes you to a very, very dark place. And that change will not come from within Israel. There are Israeli Jews that oppose what's going on. I'm friends with some of them and they're amazing. But they all say, we need outside pressure. This is not going to come from within. There's not enough of us. And that is the challenge that many of us have now who want change there, to say, right, this has to come from outside, whatever that looks like. Rather than going back to a status quo before October 7 that was not viable or sustainable or humane for Palestinians.
Antony Loewenstein, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
And the book, The Palestine Laboratory, is available. I hear there's going to be a reissue soon.
The book is available in many countries. It's being translated into about 10 languages, Spanish, Italian soon, Arabic. And it's been published, reprinted multiple times. And hopefully there'll be a film version and a podcast series this year or next year. Work in progress.
Well, keep an eye out for it then.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to our guest today, Antony Loewenstein. We always want to hear what you have to say and what you think about each of these episodes, so please share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And as always, you can find all of our episodes in audio format wherever you get your podcast from. And until next time, salam.